Welcome back to CivilNet. I'm your host, Patrick Elliott. I'm delighted to be joined again by Georgi Derluguian, a professor and a friend of the show, and sociologist. Georgi, thanks for coming on.
Good morning.
We have a lot to discuss today because you have a wealth and depth of knowledge. So I'll try to keep it within the confines of a reasonable time for our viewers. Let's start with Russia's exit from the Caucasus. There's been a lot of quite shocking stuff recently. I mean, we thought that now that the Russians have a foothold in Artsakh, they're never going to go away. It's been their dream to be in here for 30 years. You know, the only frozen conflict where Russian boots on the ground was lacking. And then just like that, they decided to leave a couple weeks ago. They have left Zvartnots, or they're in the process of leaving Zvartnots. They've left Nerkin Hind. So there's all kinds of places where they're no longer present. What's your opinion? Is this a feint? Are they secretly still here? What's going on? Are they leaving the South Caucasus?
Let's start by admitting that we have no access to any secret information. And this is probably the point to start any serious conversation, because secret information is very often diluted with disinformation. It's much more secure to start any analysis by piecing together the puzzle. You might not be able to recognize every piece of a puzzle, that it actually makes a piece of a puzzle, some freak event. And then if you're successful in piecing together the puzzle, you see that, oh, that actually makes sense as part of something larger. Second major assumption is that many puzzles that we're putting together are not of devious plots, but rather of devious plots going awry. That people fail all the time.
What is it? Never ascribed to malice what can just as easily be ascribed to incompetence?
Life is too complicated and full of unpredicted things. You know how an old song goes, I would have married an angel if I only had enough money. Or she turned me down, but I had that plan, and so forth. People have sometimes ridiculously ambitious plans. Sometimes ridiculously ambitious plans work. So this is pretty much like in real life, only it's more complicated because there are more people with more power, especially in certain historical periods, trying to compete for the same, sometimes diminishing prices. There are periods in history when things get more or less stable. Say in the 1950s, it was more or less clear that things were decided in Washington and probably in Moscow. And Paris, like it or not, would have to follow the line. And the world was pretty predictable. Then in the 1960s, it turned out that Hanoi might have a say or Havana, or maybe Beijing might intervene somewhere. Saudis would emerge as a world proselytizer for radical Islam. Things like that, they began happening more rapidly, and we are almost at the pinnacle of a situation when all former great powers had enough chance to disgrace themselves. So the United States attempted a major, very daring war in Iraq. That was not a freak accident. It was a plan, to start with the proposition that the United States would have become de facto number one member of OPEC cartel. It didn't. Russia apparently tried, or Putin, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, when I'm saying Russia, these days it's actually more correct to speak in singular. It's one man, we know his name, and I'm not sure, nobody is sure how much does he actually say in advance even to his foreign minister, or how much does he inform the rest of the cabinet. Probably not much. So here is the man who had been in power for long enough to start believing in himself and in his luck, who really became lucky several times in his life in major ways. To remind you, he started as a relatively minor agent in Eastern Germany. That was not, the specialists who know such things tell me that was not a terribly heroic position, to be spying behind several thousand Soviet armor. And that's why it was not a very high prestige, spying job. Soviet Union collapses almost with his entire organization. And look, he becomes no less than the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. And then his patron, Mayor Sobchak, loses elections in a spectacular way. And he's accused of corruption and he needs to flee the country. And Vladimir Putin then moves. And this looked like, the second complete ruin of his career, but he moves to the Kremlin instead to Moscow. And then in Moscow, he was in not very significant positions, but the president of Russia, Yeltsin, in the late 1990s, was getting into such binds, that who knew what could have ever saved Yeltsin's life and freedom? And it became very little known colonel from the former KGB, Vladimir Putin, and then he goes on and suddenly Russian economy starts growing. It needs reminding that in 2020 it looked like a third world economy. How would they ever repay their foreign debt? And then it becomes a serious country, and then suddenly there is money to pour back into the military. And that apparently what shaped the expectations of so many people in Armenia, what shaped their personal strategies, because it's very typical of humans to put your personal strategy into historical picture the way you see it. Okay, so this is what is rising, and I'm going to be part of it. I'm going to do business there, and it comes to me naturally because my uncle lives there, because I'm Armenian president and I go hunting on safari with the Russian president. And that, of course, seems like guaranteeing lots of things in the future. Yeah. It did not. So today we're in a very strange situation. It is really strange and very disconcerting when Russia is not just a neighbor of Armenia. Russia is an active enemy state. Russia is playing, Putin is playing against Armenia, not because he doesn't like Armenians. I don't think, he, in his huge perception of his role in history, he must be much beyond that, liking Azeris or disliking Armenians. He's not, just this is his game board, and he's making royal mistakes. And that's where, so the Russian position in the Caucasus is being destroyed massively. We see it for the second time since 1991. So it was very much like what we saw in Sumgait pogroms, which was Soviet propaganda could have actually hidden it. There would be rumors, like so many tragic mass events in the Stalin's period, so there would be rumors, and later historians might have gone to the archives and interviewed maybe some survivors. But because of Gorbachev and his policies, this almost immediately exploded. It was not, if not on the front page of the newspaper, but everybody knew what was going on, and actually everybody knew much more maybe than was going on. The number of casualties, so the horror of it. And the failure of Moscow to intervene decisively, one way or another, Azerbaijani or Armenian side or on the side of Soviet law, Gorbachev failed to intervene. Very much like so many politicians in the West today. He was afraid of consequences. He mumbled, he preferred to muddle through. He didn't have a policy, and he didn't have the political will, therefore, to select a policy, which opened the way to the collapse of superpower. From Sumgait to the end of a superpower, who would have thought? Just 3 years. So this was my prediction back in 2020, that the war in the 44-day war in Artsakh, the attack which the Russians failed to stopped in the very last moment. How did they do this? Nobody knew. Honestly, between us, and there is not much of a secret there. Twice, through third parties, I was asked by former colleagues from Baku, do you know what happened? They were puzzled as much as anyone. Why did we stop at the threshold of Stepanakert? That was on the minds of almost all Azeris. So what happened? What prevented us from great and complete victory? Something happened at that time. And evidently, what happened, that game could not continue. So the people, who were thinking that they were in command, that they're doing something devious, a plan with many steps, that everybody is on someone's hook, they must have miscalculated. Just last time, before I shut up, last reminder. Remember the day when Armenia signed essentially capitulation, that ceasefire, whatever they call it, in Artsakh. Russian troops began moving towards Artsakh already, and they were supported from the air by a very heavy, slow-moving combat helicopter, Mi-24. A missile flew over the border from Nakhichevan, hit that helicopter, 2 Russian pilots, pilot and navigator killed, 1 bailed out. What was that? Azerbaijan, Baku, in the person of its president, apologized within an hour. In international relations, that it usually takes days, denials, we will launch investigation, blah, blah, blah. Here, apology came in immediately, and as readily it was accepted, which cleared the path to signing the 9-point agreement. So that remained over the years my question. What was that helicopter? It could not be a freak accident. It was a targeted missile. Who was targeted in Russia? A Russian helicopter. Why did they apologize? Why did they accept? So something was going on all along, So you need to be just attuned to anomalies. And you could see that it was not a smooth relationship, because it must have had also its important sites in Syria, where Russia and Turkey continued essentially a proxy war against each other. It continued in Libya. It's another proxy war. Bayraktars on one side, the Wagner now infamous, private mercenary company on the other side, this kind of brand names. And now against the suddenly unified West, apparently Russia and Turkey need each other. And Azerbaijan is there. And to summarize, Armenia is in a very troubling and historically pretty unique situation, when it's not only Turkey being there and being actively engaged against you, it is also Russia being there and probably losing a major war in Ukraine, acting maybe with whatever, not just one hand, the remaining fingers that they can operate, in the South Caucasus, still playing, or at least, saying menacing things against you. So this is the situation in which we are now. Armenia is in much more of a battle for survival than the nice weather outside suggests.
Well, so this is a good time to ask about Armenia's Western pivot. What's your opinion on this? Are there other choices? Is it the right choice? Is it the only choice?
First, let's go through the choices. The first analytical move is always to exclude the impossible. And then to think about what Donald Rumsfeld famously named, the known unknowns, and then the unknown unknowns. So what we don't know, but we need to know, what we don't even know that we don't know. This is, in fact, the serious way of analyzing. Instead of very loudly shouting, I believe in that, I think so, what do you know? let's see actually, so what are the possibilities there? So Armenia is a very small, but much worse, landlocked territory. I do not mean the historical large Armenia, which existed last time, more than 1,000 years ago. I mean the Republic of Armenia, within its borders inherited from the Soviet Union, the borders which are still contested even today. So where would you go? Make an alliance with whom? So you need an alliance, and you're a small state in a very difficult neighborhood. So what do? So you would try Iran because it's next to you. Just why? Look, Iran operates only in the area. Iran is a pretty interesting example because majority of people try to read its action from religion and fail all the time. Iran is much better interpreted as a guerrilla state, something more in the category with Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba. So it's kind of a revolutionary state which had to go through a very destructive war with great effort. And in order to support its regime, whom nobody likes, so unlike, there is a very significant difference with North Korea or Vietnam. It's a large country whom nobody likes. It has no admirers abroad. It has no allies. Its model of Islamic Republic is an improvisation. They came up with it in a moment, when just Shah or the emperor was no longer acceptable. And what else? If you're not going to allow a bunch of students to write it as a people's republic in some leftist manner. So what else could it be? Nobody ever tried seriously to reproduce the political system of Iran. So it's not like a communist state, which would replicate other communist states. So they're trying to defend themselves, and they are against the most powerful, militarily and economically most powerful actors in the region, like Israel, and in the world, like the United States. To remind you, Iranians took hostages at American embassy. It needs to be reminded these days. Just a small joke. So one of my American freshman students, very fresh looking indeed, nice girl, looks at me and says, you know that there was an Islamic revolution in Iran, so the class is getting slightly tense. No, they didn't know, of course, this. And they took whole American embassy hostage, held it for longer than a year. She said, "Wow, professor, what did we do to them?" It's not part of textbook. It's part of films like Argo, and if you watch Argo, if you watch Rambo, you would be convinced that Americans won in Vietnam. If you watch Argo, you would know that, of course, they won in Iran. So what Iran's strategy of survival is by cultivating proxy powers, creating trouble. And it's hardly more than they can do. Creating trouble for its enemies, harassing. That's the military term, harassment, military harassment. Wherever there are organized co-religious minorities. Armenia is not one of those. No. For what reason? And these are all third world minorities, with high birth rates, like Houthis in Yemen. Yeah. So these are the people who wouldn't be counting their casualties very much. Like Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Yeah. And Iran is pretty much at the edge of its possibilities. So let's just exclude that. Yes, it's there to some extent. Is it an ally? No way, because it cannot have allies. Many of these Asian powers, they can have vassals, and it's there, like China. And it is the decision of China whether they're going to have you as a vassal. It's not your decision. You can plead allegiance. But China, again, it's such a large power, and with difficult history in its part of the world because it was the hegemonic for thousands of years. It was the hegemonic, the central power in its part of the world. That's the name of the country, Jungo, the Middle Kingdom. And they're not about exactly conquest, nor about friendships in any direction. No, it's about having vassals, and there are not very many countries willing to be vassals of China, these days, especially seeing, that China is not always a very generous, especially for some reason, in the last 10 years, China has not been very, very generous. Well, look at Sri Lanka, what happened to the economy.
Belt and Road thing.
There are
trapped this diplomacy.
Yeah, there are multiplying examples of that.
Montenegro is a big scam. The EU had to step in to pay back their debt to China for a highway.
And I think the biggest, if you follow this news, if the Financial Times is right in the intelligence, is the Russian gas. Because just to remind you, so what is a gas pipeline? It's billions of dollars put into a pipe which you cannot redirect. So if it is there, it's not like an oil tanker you can send here and then somewhere else. Once the pipeline is there, it is your client who will be dictating the rules. They are buying or not buying. By the way, this is what European Union is offering to Azerbaijan. Build the pipeline, and 10 years from now, we shall see, whether we go into our green transition, how it goes. So I don't think, that there are any allies, left to Armenia. And at the same time, there could be small sectors of coincidence. So to remind, the cynical phrase of 18th century classical diplomats from that era when gentlemen wore wigs and spoke in witty and menacing voices. There are no friends in international relations, only interests. Yeah. Only interests. So your interests somehow coincide with India, because India needs to advertise its weapon system, because not very many people have been buying Indian weapon systems so far. Yeah. They could prove actually fairly good. So India, what is serious about India is the fact, that they managed to send safely a probe to the moon, and what they're boasting, per how many 100 kilometers of the distance, it was the cheapest probe among all other countries. So India can do it, and they can do it at a budget. Maybe that, but obviously, so what remains is, of course, Europe. And not entire Europe. So Russian propaganda speaks about the unified West as if such thing were ever possible, how unified it would be. We can go into this separately, because it's actually a very serious question mark about the future of Russia itself. Russia with Western Europe and the United States, or Russia with Europe, and then where is the United States? Where is Canada in that? Where is North America in that formula? So in Europe, there was, of course, an attempt to coordinate policy. And because we see that attempts to coordinate European policy, because potentially, so if you put together all the numbers, it should look like a superpower, except that it doesn't add up. Yeah. So far, they're trying. I asked about 10 years ago, pretty major European insider, to put it this way, why do you need the European Union? Why are you doing this? And his answer to me as a historical sociologist was very persuasive, because we saw what happened to the Republic of Venice and Florence 300-400 years ago. So we don't want to become a museum, which we are becoming. Otherwise we'll be dwarfed in world relations, between China, Russia, America, and will become just a museum destination, a boutique. We want to play a role, and European Union, to put it cynically, is a club of defeated empires. They are all Belgium.
Yeah.
Think about it. Netherlands,
Yeah.
Denmark, Portugal. Not to mention the big ones. Not to mention what Austria was before 1918 and so forth. And that's why, by the way, it is my deep conviction, that the place of Russia and Turkey are also in European Union as two defeated empires, very transformed in a very different future Russia and very different future Turkey, Turkish Republic. But rightfully, it makes a lot of sense economically and geopolitically. At the moment, however, if in a group of allies, nobody takes initiative, or the kind of collective body doesn't take initiative, this is called problem of collective action, problem of elite collective action in, say, in game theory. Somebody would stand up, like we are around the table, and somebody says, "Guys, we must go. Let's repair our bus." Who is going to do the repairs? Somebody stands up and starts doing, so I will show you and that is probably France, because France is the nearest you have to a functioning empire. They didn't really lose as much as maybe other empire, for whatever historical reasons. They have pride in their culture. And interestingly enough, so they have a historical connection to Armenia and Armenians. There is something definitely to it, that the French feel something about the Middle East, not very many French, but they get reminded, so when was that, 2 weeks ago, several of my friends, not just French, Italian colleagues, a German, I teach at an international university. These are educated people. So these are people who, they're busy, but they're in physics, they are very advanced biologists or maybe economists, would come to me and ask, what's that? Because they saw Euronews from Nouvelle-Calédonie.
Yeah.
Like this was an eye-opener. So hardly anyone could have done more advertisement for Artsakh than Azerbaijan supporting a separatist movement of Melanesian native people in South Pacific with Azerbaijani flags there. So yes, France is leading the way. They need to kick, probably with some pleasure, Germany, who's screaming, but must follow suit. The fact that Brexit removed Great Britain from the equation is probably helping the French. Yeah. So now European Union could conceivably become more manageable. And so the French, quite ambitious president, is seizing this initiative. Look, it's not only Armenia.
Moldova as well.
Hey, Ukraine.
Yeah, Kazakhstan, more traditional Russian.
No.
Well, they signed a weapons agreement with Kazakhstan recently.
With everyone, so France suddenly, discovers, this part of the world, and there are kind of serious structural reasons, because France is one of very few countries that makes its own fighter jets. This is a very small, by the way, to remind you, one more is Sweden.
Yeah.
People very often overlook it.
Yeah. Griffins.
Griffins. That they can make not only Volvo, they can also make Saab. Yeah. So France is there. France promised to send troops. We don't know in what capacity to Ukraine. You see what's happening. French citizen arrested in Moscow for spying yesterday.
I didn't see that.
Somebody put a very hostile kind of mockery of a protest outside the French embassy in Moscow, which is a beautiful historical mansion, reminding the French how badly Napoleon Bonaparte had ended in Moscow. So my reading of this is that, hey, somebody in Russia is really worried about what the French are saying. So just don't think that French is going to be a neutral power, going to be viewed by Azerbaijan or by Russia as a something neutral, not exactly like Americans if they come to Armenia. So they have a reason, and there will be hostile action. So on the other hand, we saw that the former Soviet republics, which made it into European Union, they all had somebody extending a hand to them. So the miracle of Estonia, which you discussed yesterday, I think,
Yeah.
of course that Estonia shares a border and the language with Finland.
Yeah.
You know, the miracle of Lithuania is that it shares. So Armenia never had somebody, so Azerbaijan had Turkey. Armenia never had anybody, you know, outside who would really be pro-Armenian. This might be changing, not only because the French, although, again, to reveal a small secret, a pretty big, you know, to me probably a big surprise. I'm at a large academic, say, ceremony. You know, that's recently we had all kinds of graduation, and a very big shot in the French academic hierarchy leans over to me and just to probably say something nice. Said, Georgi, you know that I'm very French, Jacobin, I'm absolutely secular. But when I see Artsakh, I feel a medieval crusader rising in my soul. You know, we are still French.
Yeah.
You know, so there are all these kind of things. It's not just the Armenian diaspora in France. So it looks like if European Union can put its act together, and they must, because there is too much to lose, they can become a museum. If we can survive the coming year, which is going to be very difficult because of all kinds of elections in Western democracies, and because too many hopes placed into the outcomes of these elections in authoritarian regimes opposing them, because there is a lot of hope in Russia, in the Russian regime, you know, that they could clinch some kind of a victory. It's shifting notion what is victory in Ukraine, but at least force the removal of Zelensky and deal with some weaker, more compromising figure there, something like that. This all directly impinges on Armenia. And you have to realize that it's part of our analysis, not only what cannot happen. No, nobody is coming, you know, with their troops to save you immediately, but to understand, you know, what is the complexity and where you are becoming kind of more of an external ally than a vassal.
I want to touch up on one thing you mentioned, because it's interesting to notice the difference in speaking, the way that France is talking about Ukraine, because originally it was, there will not be a single NATO soldier on the ground. Then it became, we're going to train their officers in NATO countries. Then it became, we're going to, maybe we can send our own officers, right? Lithuania very recently proposed, we'll send our officers to train, but we won't partake in any fighting. And then the French are saying, no, we're going to come, we're going to man the borders to free up their troops so they can go and fight. So watching that shift in language, does that not give us hope that in the beginning the French were saying, we have no intention of deploying anybody here, don't expect us to have boots on the ground, but we're seeing how quickly that's shifting elsewhere. Wouldn't it be interesting that, to just never say never, to someday envisage perhaps, the way Singapore hosts both an American army port and a Chinese army port, we can host, I don't know what the Russians want to do drinking vodka in Gyumri, but we can also potentially have more of a permanent American deployment, French deployment, Indian deployment, different guarantees of our security.
I don't think, that such a cocktail would be a guarantee of any security.
Or a guarantee of violence?
Vodka with wine is not advisable. Let's put it this way. So what we need is a very sober and sufficiently informed discussion about the range of Armenian foreign policies. There are, as I understand, quite many diplomats, and there are lots of people in Armenia here who are willing to speak about it. Sometimes they speak very loudly and very emotionally about it, but my appeal with them to be, hey, if you are really professionals, you must kind of put on your professional suit and discuss alternatives. Because what is troubling, you are going probably to ask me about the current protest movement in the streets. What is really troubling is that nobody even tries to discuss, or correct me if they are trying to discuss, what are going to do next. So what are the next steps? Okay, so you seized power in the moment when probably any prudent politician would rather stay away and allow the opponents so far in office to make all the possible mistakes, because the situation is extremely difficult. It's a slippery slope. It's very dangerous. So if you're claiming not just to come to power, but to grab the steering wheel of a car which is on a virage somewhere in the mountains, what are you going to do? How are you going to steer? We need something different, but it doesn't need doesn't mean that we should stay away. We should soberly, but also with enough information, discuss what are the options. When I say enough information, we really don't know. Eric Hakopian here said several times, that all other things being equal, but honestly, we don't know what was happening with the prime minister last week. He knew probably something we didn't know. He was going, last week, I think, to make a very important speech.
2 Fridays ago.
2 Fridays ago, yeah. And then he reduced Eric Hakopian to putting Homer Simpson instead, blah, 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 blah. It is one of my favorite questions. What was that? I teach a course for my students called Reading Newspapers Between the Lines. It's very outdated now because it's not newspapers. But I teach them, notice something strange. Notice something which should be there, but it's not. One of the very common anomalies is what is missing. So what is necessary is we desperately need in Armenia more responsible and professional journalism. It's very hard to get information in Armenia. Yeah. Instead of I understand information costs money. Professionalism is precious. Yeah. Professionalism, be it in dentistry or in IT sector, the same thing. It costs money, and it's a total commitment. It's not very much. Issuing your commentary on YouTube on your own. I'm running my own channel. So we need both this kind of information, and we need a variety of think tanks. How could that be supported? Well, CivilNet probably gives one possible model, how it could be supported, without being affiliated with this or that former ruling group. And we need to bring people both from diaspora. That's simply because many of them have enough competence to discuss things. So what are the politics, and responsibly discuss. So what are the politics in their countries, and this is where there is a huge advantage. As I always said, perhaps jokingly, that Armenians have the biggest drawback in their own nationalism. They're too nationalist domestically. Internationally, the greatest comparative advantage of Armenians is their nationalism. Because, you and me, you are from Canada, I'm from Russia. What the hell are we doing here speaking about Armenia in Yerevan? Right? Look at how much do we look like Armenians? And so forth, and yet we're here. We are on this side of the barricade, because we chose it. Yeah. And there are potentially many more, and I'm sure many more whom we could engage. Not the people who already go with T-shirts, saying diaspora, or the people who are more like my son. So, my son works in LA. He was on Oscar-winning film crew twice already. You probably saw that film about the last repair shop, which is led by ethnic Armenian from Baku. Mm-hmm. Okay, for how long did Armenians try to get a film about genocide into the Oscars? Yeah. And we got it. We did it, so how many even noticed? So he doesn't join any Armenian diaspora groups. When I ask him, he said, Dad, what's the point? They get together and they make dolma. So otherwise, they get into big black cars and they wave flags and honk. Yeah. So if we can engage more people, like my son, who would be quite reluctant, to get into these things, who asks me, so dad, so what is Armenian in me? Okay, my last name is Derluguian, but otherwise, it's a freak accident. I inherited this name on the male succession line. Otherwise, what makes me an Armenian? If we can work more with those, I think there are big possibilities, for Armenian foreign policy, for everything, for economic policy. So in this respect, in the longer run, if Armenia survives for another year or two, I'm pretty optimistic. This place is doing much better than Armenians normally assume. Yeah. Armenians are traditionally very pessimistic people.
Yep. Yes. It's one of my big gripes, unfortunately, with our culture. We have. Do you know the Yiddish term kvetch?
I suspect I know. I don't know.
New York Jews, they're known, right? It's called kvetching. It's to complain just to complain, not seeking a solution. It's just to kind of commiserate, and we take that to a whole new level. And it's to the point now where, look,
well,
what are we doing if we're not seeking solutions?
We're in good company. It's very common, and it's. Honestly, what I explained to my Azerbaijani friends, I do have Azerbaijani friends. I'm not going to name any names. So when I feel like they're so good friends, that I can tease them, guys, you're really trying hard to become Armenians. You're complaining all the time. Yes. This is very typical of especially people, who do not realize that they are in a real game with stakes. So if you are watching football, especially if you're watching from a coach at home, you can complain, and people always complain. That that's a missed opportunity. Try being on the team, at least on the second team, and realize that something you could make it into the first team. You might actually have to go in the field. So that's a whole different level of responsibility. And also realize one more thing. You asked me about the future possibilities, that strange things also happen. Bad things happen. Like we are in an improbable constellation that the world is going through a world war, in my opinion. It is a world war already, by proxy so far. But if ever French soldiers are going to shoot down a Russian airplane over Ukraine, it could be pretty much a war. It's pretty much like what 1937, imagine. There is civil war in Spain. Germans and Italians on one side. Russians and who not on the other side. And this is the same time when Japanese are moving towards Nanjing in China. And these were the peaceful years. This was not yet World War. So something like that is happening now. Terrible things happen, but like in my favorite game, the game of backgammon, in Nardi, in Tavla, there is dice. And double shesh, douchesh sometimes happens. So you must have a plan. What if we really get lucky? What if douchesh happens? We must be able to use, instead of mumbling, we should be able to use it immediately. When it doesn't happen, we should have the plan A, B, C, and navigate through it. That's all we can do.
It's a perfect place to stop. Professor Georgi, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks again for watching CivilNet.